Hello guys. If you like our content and you love scary stories, then subscribe, like, and write in the comments your scary stories so that we write your story. Scary viewing and terrifying sensations to you. The Shadows of Winterfold, the Cursed Village. Part 1. The History of Winterfold. Nestled deep within the heart of rural England lies the village of Winterfold. The village, with its quaint cottages and cobblestone streets, seems like something out of a storybook. However, beneath its picturesque exterior lies a dark and terrifying history that has haunted its inhabitants for centuries. Winterfold was founded in the early 1500s, during a time when superstition and fear of the supernatural were rampant. The village was small, with only a handful of families living there. They were an isolated community, cut off from the outside world by dense forests and treacherous terrain. The villagers relied on farming and hunting for their survival, and they rarely ventured beyond the boundaries of their village. For many years, Winterfold was a peaceful place. The villagers went about their daily lives, tending to their crops and livestock. But everything changed one fateful winter, when a stranger arrived in the village. The stranger was a man of unknown origin, with wild, unkempt hair and piercing blue eyes. He claimed to be a traveler who had lost his way in the forest. The villagers, wary of outsiders, were hesitant to offer him shelter, but the bitter cold and the stranger's pitiful condition swayed their decision. They allowed him to stay in an old, abandoned cottage on the outskirts of the village. It wasn't long before strange occurrences began to plague the village. Animals went missing, crops withered, and the weather grew increasingly harsh. The villagers began to whisper that the stranger had brought a curse upon them. The stranger himself grew more reclusive, only emerging from his cottage at night. Some claimed to have seen him wandering the village in the dead of night, muttering to himself in a language no one could understand. One night, the village elder, a man named Thomas Abernathy, decided to confront the stranger. Accompanied by a group of villagers, he made his way to the cottage. What they found inside would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The cottage was filled with strange symbols carved into the walls and floor. In the center of the room was a makeshift altar, covered in blood and animal bones. The stranger was nowhere to be found, but the air was thick with the smell of death and decay. The villagers were horrified and fled the cottage, vowing to never speak of what they had seen. The following morning, the stranger was found hanging from a tree in the village square. His body was twisted and contorted, as if he had been in agony. The villagers were relieved that the source of their suffering was gone, but the damage had already been done. The curse had taken root, and Winterfold would never be the same. Part 2. The haunting begins. After the stranger's death, the curse of Winterfold began to manifest in more sinister ways. The weather grew colder, and the village was soon blanketed in a thick layer of snow. The once fertile land became barren, and the villagers struggled to survive. Food was scarce, and the harsh winter claimed the lives of many. But it wasn't just the weather that tormented the villagers. Strange apparitions began to appear in the village. Ghostly figures were seen wandering the streets at night, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The villagers heard whispers in the darkness, voices that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The most terrifying of these apparitions was that of the stranger. His ghost was seen often, standing at the edge of the village, watching the villagers with those same piercing blue eyes. He never spoke, but his presence filled the villagers with an overwhelming sense of dread. One by one, the villagers began to fall ill. They were plagued by nightmares and visions of the stranger. Some claimed to have seen him standing at the foot of their bed, watching them as they slept. Others spoke of a dark figure that would follow them wherever they went, always just out of sight. As the illness spread, the villagers grew desperate. They sought the help of a local priest, hoping that he could rid them of the curse. The priest, Father Jonathan, was a pious man who had spent his life fighting against the forces of darkness. He agreed to help the villagers and made his way to Winterfold. Upon his arrival, Father Jonathan could sense the evil that had taken hold of the village. The air was thick with it, and the villagers themselves were pale and gaunt, their eyes hollow with fear. He knew that he was facing something far more powerful than he had ever encountered before. Father Jonathan began by blessing each of the villagers, hoping to protect them from the curse. He then made his way to the stranger's cottage, determined to cleanse it of the evil that lingered there. As he entered the cottage, he could feel the temperature drop. The walls were still covered in the strange symbols, and the altar was untouched, as if time had stood still since the night the villagers had discovered it. Father Jonathan prayed over the cottage, calling upon the power of God to banish the evil from Winterfold. But as he prayed, the air grew colder, and the shadows in the room began to move. The priest could feel a presence in the room with him, something dark and malevolent. Suddenly, the door to the cottage slammed shut, and the room was plunged into darkness. Father Jonathan could hear the sound of footsteps approaching, but he could see nothing. The temperature continued to drop, and the priest could see his breath in the air. He continued to pray, but the presence grew stronger until it was almost unbearable. Just as Father Jonathan thought he could take no more, the presence disappeared, and the room returned to its normal temperature. The door to the cottage slowly creaked open, and the priest stumbled out into the snow. He was shaken, but he knew that the evil in Winterfold was far from defeated. Part 3. The Disappearances. Father Jonathan's arrival in Winterfold had given the villagers hope, but that hope was short-lived. Despite the priest's blessings and prayers, the curse continued to tighten its grip on the village. The apparitions grew more frequent, and the villagers' health continued to deteriorate. Then, the disappearances began. The first to vanish was a young girl named Mary. She was just 7 years old, with bright blue eyes and golden hair. Mary had always been a cheerful child, full of life and energy, but in the days leading up to her disappearance, she had become withdrawn and quiet. She spoke of strange dreams, of a man with blue eyes who would visit her at night. One morning, Mary's parents awoke to find her bed empty. There were no signs of a struggle, and the front door was still locked from the inside. The only clue was a single set of small footprints leading from her bed to the door, and then disappearing into the snow outside. The villagers searched for her tirelessly, but Mary was never found. Her disappearance sent shockwaves through Winterfold. The villagers, already on edge from the haunting, were now consumed by fear for their children. They kept their families close, refusing to let their children out of their sight. But despite their precautions, more children began to vanish. Each disappearance followed the same pattern. The children would complain of nightmares, of a man with piercing blue eyes who whispered to them in their sleep. Then, they would disappear in the night, leaving no trace behind except for those same small footprints in the snow. The village was in a state of panic. Parents stayed up all night, guarding their homes and watching over their children. But it was no use. The man with blue eyes, the ghost of the stranger, seemed to be unstoppable. He could come and go as he pleased, taking the children whenever he wanted. Desperate, the villagers turned to Father Jonathan once more. The priest, now deeply troubled by the events in Winterfold, decided to take drastic measures. He proposed that they conduct an exorcism, a ritual that would rid the village of the evil that had taken hold. The exorcism was scheduled for the next full moon, a time when the veil between the living and the dead was said to be at its thinnest. The villagers gathered in the church, the only place they felt was safe from the curse. The children were kept close, their parents clutching them tightly as Father Jonathan began the ritual. The priest prayed with all his might, calling upon the power of God to banish the spirit of the stranger from Winterfold. The church was filled with the sound of chanting, the villagers' voices joining in as they begged for deliverance. But as the ritual reached its climax, a terrible scream echoed through the church. The doors burst open, and a cold wind swept through the building, extinguishing the candles and plunging the room into darkness. The villagers huddled together, their hearts pounding with fear. In the darkness, they could see the faint outline of a figure at the entrance of the church. It was the stranger, his blue eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. He stared at the villagers, his presence filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. Father Jonathan stood his ground, holding up his crucifix and continuing to pray. But the stranger was unfazed. He began to walk slowly down the aisle, his footsteps echoing in the silent church. As he passed each pew, the villagers could feel a cold hand grip their hearts, as if the life was being drained from them. The stranger stopped in front of Father Jonathan, his gaze piercing through the priest's soul. For a moment, there was silence, and then, with a sudden, violent gust of wind, the stranger vanished, leaving the church in ruins. Part 4. The Descent into Madness. The failed exorcism marked the beginning of the end for Winterfold. The village, once a place of hope and community, had become a living nightmare. The curse had taken hold of every corner of the village, and there was no escaping it. The villagers, already weakened by the cold and the loss of their children, began to descend into madness. They spoke of seeing the stranger everywhere, his blue eyes watching them from the shadows. Some claimed to hear the voices of the missing children, calling out to them in the night. The paranoia grew, and the villagers turned on each other. Accusations of witchcraft and devil worship were rampant. Families who had lived together in harmony for generations were now at each other's throats. The village elder, Thomas Abernathy, was one of the first to succumb to the madness. He became convinced that the curse was the work of one of the villagers, someone who had made a pact with the devil. In his desperation, he began to interrogate his fellow villagers, demanding that they confess their sins. Abernathy's behavior became increasingly erratic. He would wander the village at night, searching for signs of the stranger. He claimed to have seen the ghostly figure of the stranger lurking in the woods, watching him with those piercing blue eyes. The other villagers began to avoid him, fearing that he had lost his mind. But Abernathy was not the only one to fall into madness. The villagers, already terrified and isolated, began to see the stranger in their dreams, in the shadows, and even in the faces of their loved ones. They became suspicious of each other, and the once tight-knit community began to unravel. Father Jonathan, now desperate to save the village, decided to seek help from the outside world. He made the perilous journey through the snow-covered forest to the nearest town, where he begged the local authorities for help. But when he returned to Winterfold with a group of men, they found the village in chaos. The villagers had turned on each other, accusing one another of being in league with the stranger. Several homes had been burned to the ground, and the bodies of those accused of witchcraft were found hanging from the trees. The village was a scene of carnage, and the few survivors were left cowering in the ruins. Father Jonathan, overwhelmed by the horror of what had happened, fell to his knees and wept. He had failed to save the village, and now it was too late. The curse had consumed Winterfold, leaving nothing but death and despair in its wake. Part 5. The Final Sacrifice. As Winterfold descended into madness, the remaining villagers realized that there was only one way to end the curse. They believed that the stranger's ghost could only be appeased through a final, desperate act of sacrifice. They would have to offer up one of their own to the spirit in order to break the curse. Father Jonathan, now broken and despairing, reluctantly agreed to perform the ritual. He knew that the village was beyond saving, but he couldn't bring himself to leave the people he had tried so hard to protect. The villagers, driven to the brink of insanity, agreed that Thomas Abernathy should be the one to be sacrificed. He had been the first to see the stranger, and they believed that he was the one who had brought the curse upon them. Abernathy, now completely mad, accepted his fate. He believed that his sacrifice would save the village and atone for his sins. The villagers gathered in the church once more, the building now a shadow of its former self. The windows were shattered, and the walls were cracked and crumbling. The air was thick with the stench of death and decay. Father Jonathan led Abernathy to the altar, where the sacrifice was to take place. The villagers, their faces gaunt and hollow, watched in silence as the ritual began. The priest prayed, his voice trembling with fear and sorrow. Abernathy knelt before the altar, his hands clasped in prayer, his eyes fixed on the crucifix above him. As Father Jonathan raised his hands to perform the final blessing, the church was filled with a deafening roar. The ground shook, and the walls began to crumble. The villagers screamed as the roof caved in, burying them under a mountain of rubble. But amid the chaos, Abernathy remained kneeling at the altar, his eyes locked on the crucifix. He could see the stranger standing behind Father Jonathan, his blue eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. Abernathy closed his eyes and whispered a final prayer, offering his life in exchange for the salvation of Winterfold. The stranger reached out a hand, and the church was plunged into darkness. When the dust settled, Abernathy's body was found lying at the foot of the altar, his face frozen in a final expression of peace. The curse had been broken, but the cost had been unimaginable. Part 6. The Aftermath. With the curse broken, the village of Winterfold was left in ruins. The few survivors who emerged from the wreckage were haunted by the memories of what had happened. They had lost everything: their homes, their families, and their sanity. Father Jonathan, the only one who had survived the collapse of the church, was left a broken man. He could no longer bear the weight of the guilt that he carried. He had failed to protect the village, and the lives of the people he had tried so hard to save were now lost forever. The survivors fled Winterfold, leaving the village to rot in the snow-covered wilderness. They made their way to the nearest town, where they told their story to anyone who would listen. But few believed them, dismissing their tale as the ravings of madmen. Winterfold became a ghost town, its name synonymous with death and despair. The village was never rebuilt, and the land around it was left untouched. The forest that had once surrounded the village grew wild and untamed, hiding the ruins from sight. But even though Winterfold was abandoned, the curse that had plagued the village was not entirely gone. Travelers who ventured too close to the site reported strange occurrences: unexplained lights in the woods, ghostly figures in the ruins, and whispers on the wind. Father Jonathan, unable to live with his guilt, took his own life shortly after leaving Winterfold. His body was found hanging from a tree near the village, a rope around his neck and a note pinned to his chest. The note reads simply, "Forgive me." Part 7. The Return of the Strange... Years passed, and Winterfold became little more than a footnote in history. The village was forgotten, its story lost to time. But the curse of Winterfold was not done. In the early 1900s, a group of researchers, intrigued by the legend of the cursed village, set out to uncover the truth behind the haunting of Winterfold. Led by Professor Henry Cartwright, an esteemed historian with a fascination for the supernatural, the team was determined to find the ruins of the village and learn what had really happened all those years ago. The team consisted of 4 people: Professor Cartwright, his assistant Margaret, a photographer named William, and a medium named Eleanor. Each of them had their own reasons for joining the expedition. Margaret was eager to prove herself as a scholar, William wanted to capture evidence of the paranormal, and Eleanor was driven by a sense of duty to confront the lingering spirits. As they made their way through the dense forest, the air grew colder, and a heavy fog settled over the landscape. The trees, twisted and gnarled, seemed to close in around them, as if they were being watched. But the group pressed on, determined to reach the village before nightfall. After hours of trekking through the unforgiving terrain, they finally arrived at the edge of the ruins. Winterfold lay before them, a desolate and eerie place. The cottages, once quaint and charming, were now little more than crumbling husks. The church, where the final sacrifice had taken place, was a collapsed ruin, its walls covered in ivy and moss. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant howl of the wind. As they set up camp in the center of the village, Professor Cartwright couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone. The shadows seemed to move on their own, and the air was thick with a sense of foreboding. But he pushed these thoughts aside, focusing on the task at hand. The group began their investigation the next morning, starting with the remains of the church. Eleanor, the medium, was particularly sensitive to the lingering energy of the place. As she walked through the ruins, she felt a cold hand brush against her cheek, and a voice whispered in her ear, "Leave this place." Eleanor, though shaken, did not waver. She believed that the spirits were trapped in Winterfold, unable to find peace because of the curse. She was determined to help them move on, but she knew that it would not be easy. As they continued their exploration, William began to take photographs of the village. He was particularly interested in capturing images of the church, where the final sacrifice had occurred. But as he developed the photos that evening, he noticed something strange. In every photo, there was a faint, ghostly figure standing in the background. The figure was tall and thin, with piercing blue eyes that seemed to stare directly at the camera. William showed the photos to the rest of the group, and they were all disturbed by what they saw. The figure, unmistakably the ghost of the stranger, was present in every image. It was clear that the curse of Winterfold was still very much alive. Eleanor, sensing that the spirit of the stranger was still lingering in the village, decided to conduct a séance that night. She believed that if they could communicate with the spirit, they might be able to break the curse once and for all. The group agreed, albeit reluctantly, and gathered in the center of the village as the sun began to set. Part 8. The Séance. The séance was held under the darkened sky, with only the light of a few flickering candles to illuminate the circle. The group sat in silence, their hands joined, as Eleanor began to call out to the spirits of Winterfold. Her voice, steady and calm, echoed through the night as she invoked the presence of the stranger. At first, there was nothing but silence. The wind had died down, and the night was eerily still. But then, slowly, the temperature began to drop. A cold, unnatural chill settled over the group, and the air grew thick with tension. Suddenly, the candles flickered and went out, plunging the group into darkness. The silence was broken by the sound of footsteps, soft and deliberate, approaching them from all sides. Eleanor's grip on the other's hands tightened as she continued to call out to the spirits, urging them to reveal themselves. Out of the darkness, a low, guttural voice began to speak. It was a voice that none of them recognized, filled with malice and anger. The voice accused them of trespassing, of disturbing the dead. It warned them to leave before it was too late. Eleanor, despite her fear, remained resolute. She asked the spirit what it wanted, why it continued to haunt Winterfold. The voice responded with a single word: vengeance. The ground beneath them began to tremble, and the wind picked up once more, howling through the ruins. The group could hear the sound of stones shifting and wood creaking, as if the village itself was coming to life. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and then the figure of the stranger appeared before them. He was exactly as he had been described in the legends: tall, gaunt, with wild hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to burn with an inner fire. The stranger's ghost stared at each of them in turn, his expression one of hatred and contempt. Eleanor tried to reason with the spirit, to offer it peace, but the stranger would not be swayed. He had been wronged in life, and his anger had only grown stronger in death. He blamed the villagers for his suffering, for the curse that had befallen Winterfold, and he sought to make them pay even in death. As the spirit grew more agitated, the ground beneath the group began to crack, and the air was filled with the sound of distant wailing. The spirits of the villagers, trapped by the curse, were awakening, and they were not happy. The seance had unleashed something far more powerful than Eleanor had anticipated. The group was surrounded by shadows, the spirits of the damned converging on them. Eleanor, realizing the danger they were in, broke the circle and shouted for the others to run. But it was too late. The shadows closed in, and the group was engulfed in darkness. Part 9. The Escape. When Professor Cartwright awoke, he found himself lying on the cold ground, the remnants of the seance scattered around him. The air was thick with smoke, and the smell of burning wood filled his nostrils. He could hear the faint crackling of flames in the distance, but all he could see was darkness. He called out for the others, but there was no response. Panic set in as he struggled to his feet, his heart pounding in his chest. The village was on fire, the flames licking at the edges of the ruins. But there was something else, something far more terrifying. He could hear the voices of the spirits, their cries of anguish and rage echoing through the night. Professor Cartwright stumbled through the village, searching for his companions. He found William first, lying motionless on the ground, his camera shattered beside him. The professor shook him, but William did not stir. The life had been drained from his eyes, leaving him as cold and lifeless as the ruins around him. Cartwright was overcome with grief, but there was no time to mourn. He had to find Margaret and Eleanor before it was too late. He called out their names, his voice hoarse and desperate, but the only answer was the wail of the spirits. He finally found Margaret near the edge of the village, half buried in the snow. She was alive, but barely. Her eyes were wide with fear, her body trembling uncontrollably. She muttered incoherently, her mind shattered by the horrors she had witnessed. Cartwright lifted her to her feet and tried to comfort her, but she recoiled from his touch. She kept repeating the same words over and over again, "He's coming. He's coming." The professor knew that they had to leave, but there was no sign of Eleanor. He couldn't abandon her, not after everything they had been through. But as he turned to search for her, he saw the figure of the stranger standing in the flames. The ghostly figure was watching them, his blue eyes glowing with malice. The professor could feel the hatred radiating from the spirit, a hatred so intense that it seemed to burn the air around them. He knew then that they had no choice but to flee. With Margaret clinging to his arm, Professor Cartwright made his way through the burning village. The flames roared around them, but the spirits were not far behind. He could hear their voices, calling out to him, urging him to join them in the darkness. Just as they reached the edge of the forest, a hand grabbed Cartwright's shoulder. He turned, expecting to see Eleanor, but instead he found himself face to face with the stranger. The spirit's icy grip sent a shock of pain through his body, and he felt the cold seeping into his bones. But before the stranger could drag him into the darkness, a burst of light erupted from behind them. Eleanor, bruised and battered, stood at the edge of the forest, holding up a small silver cross. The light from the cross seemed to repel the spirit, and with a scream of rage, the stranger vanished into the night. Eleanor collapsed to the ground, her strength finally giving out. Cartwright rushed to her side, but she was fading fast. She had used the last of her power to save them, and there was nothing more he could do. With tears in his eyes, Professor Cartwright carried Eleanor's lifeless body into the forest, Margaret following close behind. The flames of Winterfold continued to burn behind them, consuming the village and the curse that had haunted it for so long. Part 10. The Legacy of Winterfold. In the years that followed, the story of Winterfold became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of meddling with forces beyond our understanding. Professor Cartwright and Margaret never spoke of what had happened in the village, but the memories haunted them for the rest of their lives. The ruins of Winterfold were eventually reclaimed by the forest, and the village was forgotten once more. But the curse of Winterfold, though weakened, was not entirely gone. Travelers who ventured too close to the site still reported strange occurrences, whispers in the wind, ghostly figures in the trees, and the feeling of being watched. Professor Cartwright dedicated the remainder of his life to studying the paranormal, but he never returned to Winterfold. He knew that some mysteries were better left unsolved, and that some curses could never be broken. Margaret, traumatized by the events, left academia and lived out her days in seclusion. She never married, never had children, and spent her nights haunted by the nightmares of Winterfold. As for Eleanor, her sacrifice was not forgotten. Professor Cartwright had a small gravestone erected for her at the edge of the forest, near the site of the village. It bore no name, only the inscription, "Here lies a brave soul who faced the darkness." The village of Winterfold may have been destroyed, but its legacy lived on. The curse, born of hatred and vengeance, was a reminder of the darkness that can linger in the hearts of men, and the dangers of disturbing the restless dead. And so Winterfold remained a ghost town, its story passed down through the generations as a warning to those who might be tempted to explore the unknown. For the curse of Winterfold was a curse that could never be fully erased, a curse that would continue to haunt the land for all eternity.